Ex-Army Ranger, everyone laughed when he said he was bilingual, until what he did shocked everyone. Before we begin, tell me something about where you live. What's the weather like today? The mop head hit the marble floor at 5:47 in the morning, and Alan Reeves didn't flinch at the cold. He never did. The 34th floor of the Hale Capitol building was silent except for the low hum of the ventilation system and the wet drag of his work across the tile. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan was waking up. Orange light bleeding in from the east, taxis beginning to clot the avenues below. The city assembling itself like it did every morning, indifferent to the men who cleaned it before the important people arrived. Alan had been doing this for 3 years. 3 years of arriving before dawn, of finishing before the executives stepped off the elevator, of making everything gleam without ever being thanked. He was, in the purest sense of the word, invisible. And most days that was fine. Most days he kept his head down and thought about Jai. Jai was 7 years old and had his mother's eyes, that deep, steady brown that seemed to hold more than it should. Eyes that looked at you and made you feel like you were being read, page by page. Alan never told Jai that. He just noticed it sometimes in the morning when he dropped him at school. That particular gaze his son gave him right before they parted, calm, certain, deeply trusting. The gaze of a child who had no reason to doubt the world because his father had always made sure the world was steady. That was the job. Not the mopping, not the scrubbing, not the long ride home on the subway in his uniform that smelled faintly of bleach and industrial soap. The real job was Jai. Everything else was just how you paid for it. Alan had grown up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the son of a mechanic and a school cafeteria worker. Neither of his parents had gone to college. Neither had traveled much beyond the state line. But they had taught him things that people with degrees sometimes never learned. Things like, you look a man in the eye when you speak to him. You do the work in front of you. You don't complain about what you don't have. You take care of what's yours. These were not grand philosophies. They were just the rules his father had lived by, passed down quietly like tools in a garage, worn smooth from use. Alan had carried those rules into the Army at 19 and come out at 26 changed in ways he still didn't have language for. But the rules had held. The rules had always held. He thought about this sometimes. The invisibility. Not with bitterness, but with the calm attention of a man who had been trained to assess situations accurately. Bitterness was a weight you carried that gave you nothing back. He had seen it corrode better men than him. Men who had served and come home and found that the country moved on while they stood still. Men who let the corrosion become their whole identity until there was nothing left but the grievance. He had made a different choice. He chose the morning light. He chose the toast and the drawings and the small steady rituals of a life built deliberately, on purpose, with care. He chose Jai every single day over every other version of himself that could have made a different choice. That was not nothing. That was, in his private accounting, the most important work he had ever done. He wrung out the mop and moved to the next section of corridor, past the glass-walled conference room where the big meetings happened. He had cleaned that room hundreds of times. He knew every scratch in the table's veneer, every scuff on the chair legs, the spot near the west window where the carpet had a faint watermark that never fully lifted. He knew the room better than the people who used it. That was another form of invisibility, knowing something thoroughly without being acknowledged for knowing it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Mrs. Delgado, who watched Jai before school. He ate all his oatmeal, said he's going to draw you something today. Alan read it twice and allowed himself exactly one small smile before tucking the phone back. He had learned to contain joy like that. Keep it small, keep it close. Too much happiness in uncertain terrain was a liability. Another thing the Army had taught him. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. He had overheard it 3 days earlier. The entire 34th floor needed to be spotless for a major investor presentation. Groups from Tokyo and Frankfurt. Alan had made it spotless. He had come in 2 hours early and done the baseboards and the window ledges and the tracks of the sliding conference room doors. He did it without being asked. He did it because it was the right thing to do. No one would know. That was fine. That was... At 9:30, the elevator began moving more frequently. Heels on marble. The smell of expensive coffee. Low, confident voices. Alan gathered his cart and moved toward the service corridor, knowing the rhythm of the building the way a good soldier knows a mission. He had turned the corner when he heard Marcus Webb, Victoria Hale's senior operations manager, near the reception desk. "I need someone to check the East Conference Room. Investors are coming up in 20, pitchers filled, display calibrated, temperature set." "I can do it," Alan said. Webb turned. He was the kind of man who wore his confidence like a collar, tight, expensive, a little constricting. He looked at Alan the way people sometimes look at a dog that has spoken. A half-second of recalibration, then the narrowing of the eyes just before dismissal. "Reeves, right? Cleaning crew?" "Yes, sir." "Right. Just fill the pitchers. Don't touch anything else." He said it without cruelty. Just absence. Alan went to the conference room. He filled the pitchers. He found a loose cable on the display and tightened it. He adjusted the thermostat 1 degree because cold rooms made people impatient. He straightened 2 chairs. He wiped a smudge from the main screen. None of this was what he was told to do. All of it needed to be done. He left at 9:51 and was pushing his cart back when the investors arrived. There were 6 of them, 3 from Tokyo, 3 from Frankfurt, moving like men accustomed to being the most important people in any room. Victoria Hale met them at the elevator. She was 27, had inherited the firm at 24, and had not merely maintained what her father built but expanded it. Sharp in the way that earned respect rather than fear. He was almost to the service corridor when Webb stopped him. The interpreter had called in sick. Several investors preferred their native language for technical discussions. Webb was explaining it to a janitor not because he expected a solution, but because there was no one else nearby. Alan said it quietly, without drama, without pride. The flat plainness of a man stating a fact. "I speak both languages, Japanese and German, if it would help." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then he watched it happen, the thing he had learned to expect. Webb's expression moved through surprise, then skepticism, then something closer to amusement. A junior associate let out a short sound, not quite a laugh, but close enough. And from the cluster near the conference room door it spread. A murmur, then another, then a barely suppressed chuckle from somewhere he couldn't see. The janitor speaks Japanese and German. He watched it ripple through them like a stone dropped in still water. He had seen that ripple before. He knew exactly what it felt like from the inside. The particular humiliation of being laughed at not for being wrong, but for existing outside the space where you were expected to stay. The logic was airtight if you never questioned its first assumption. Victoria Hale had turned at the sound. Her eyes found Alan across the corridor, and she assessed him quickly, completely, without revealing the assessment. For a moment he thought she might cut through it. She didn't. She said quietly, "We'll figure it out. Let's get everyone seated." And then she moved into the conference room. The investors followed, and Alan stood in the corridor with his mop cart and the room he had made perfect for people who didn't know he existed. He breathed in once slowly, all the way to the bottom. He had learned to breathe like that in conditions where breathing was the only thing you could control. He had learned a great many things in conditions like that, and he had kept most of them quiet for 3 years, because Jai didn't need a father fighting old wars. But the laughter had landed in the old, quiet place where a man keeps the things he knows about himself with absolute certainty. In that place, something had shifted, like a loose cable, finally seated. He pushed the cart to the service corridor and stopped. He stood very still. He thought about Jai's drawing. He thought about oatmeal. He thought about the way his son looked at him with those steady, reading eyes before school every morning, and how that look, so trusting, so certain, was the only judgment that had ever mattered to him, the only verdict worth anything in the long accounting of his life. Then he turned the cart around. He walked back down the marble corridor, the way he walked into every situation that mattered, back to the conference room door. And he stood there for a moment with his hand on the frame, and he thought about every floor he had ever cleaned, and every morning he had ever made toast, and every time his son had looked at him with those reading eyes, Then he knocked once, and he stepped inside. There was a specific kind of man that the army produced, not the loud, decorated hero of the movies, but the quieter kind who had learned that silence was not weakness but discretion, who had brought home skills that had no obvious civilian application, and so carried them inward, invisible, like a second skeleton that no one ever saw. Alan was that kind, and the thing that the gray uniform concealed was not shame. It was simply patience. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on 168th Street in Washington Heights, and in the morning, the light came through the kitchen window at a low angle that turned the old linoleum gold for about 20 minutes before climbing out of reach. Alan had learned to sit at the kitchen table during those 20 minutes whenever he could. It cost nothing and it was beautiful. He drank his coffee and watched the light and thought about whatever needed thinking about. The bills, the next school payment, whether Jai's shoes were getting too small again, how much overtime he could reasonably take before it started to affect his mornings with his son. These were not dramatic concerns. They were the concerns of a man doing the careful math of his life because the margins were narrow and the math had to work. He had moved to New York 3 years ago after the divorce. Carla had kept the apartment in Raleigh, which was right. She had grown up there. Jai had spent his first years there, and Alan had been away for so much of that time that the apartment felt more like hers than his anyway. The divorce had been quiet. Not easy. Nothing about it was easy. But quiet. No screaming matches, no lawyers who got rich off hatred. Just two people who had tried and grown in directions that didn't converge anymore. And a child who needed both of them to be functional more than he needed them to be together. Carla had suggested that Jai come to New York with Alan. She had a new job in Seattle, and the timing was what it was, and Jai was 7, and boys needed their fathers, and she trusted Alan in the way you can only trust someone you once loved completely, with full knowledge of their flaws and full confidence in their character. He thought about that sometimes, the weight of her trust. The way she had handed him their son like a confirmation of something. He had not taken it lightly for a single day. Jai woke up at 6:15 every morning like a clock. Not an alarm clock, nothing dramatic, no startle, no immediate noise. He simply opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way children assess whether the day is worth meeting, and then sat up. Alan was usually already in the kitchen. He would hear the soft thud of small feet on the floor, then the shuffle of the hallway. Then Jai would appear in the doorway wearing his dinosaur pajamas with the fraying left cuff and the look of a man who has arrived from a long journey and is deciding whether the destination was worth it. "Morning, bud," Alan would say, and Jai would say, "Is there toast?" This was their ritual. Not because toast was extraordinary. It was bread and heat and butter, the most ordinary breakfast in the world, but because the asking of it was the thread between them at the start of every day, the small confirmation that this was home, that Alan was here, that the world was in its correct arrangement. Alan always had toast. He had never once failed to have toast. There were mornings when money was tight enough that he was calculating the week's groceries on the back of his attention. But there was always toast. This was not a grand gesture. It was a man keeping his word in the smallest possible terms over and over, in the way that small constancies build the kind of trust that children carry into adulthood without knowing where it came from. After breakfast, Jai would show Alan whatever he was working on. A drawing, usually. He was deeply in love with drawing, not in the performed way that some children display talent to get attention, but in the absorbed way of a kid who would forget to eat if you let him. He drew animals mostly. Elephants with improbably long eyelashes, dinosaurs in business suits, a recurring character who appeared to be a very tired bear carrying a briefcase. Alan had taped 17 of these drawings to the refrigerator. He would have taped more, but he had run out of magnets. There were other things about him that people at Hale Capital did not see, because seeing requires looking and looking requires a reason. The other cleaners on the shift knew Alan as the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who always covered the baseboards without being asked. They liked him without knowing him, in the easy way of people who work side by side in silence. He did not mind this. He had always been more comfortable with people who required nothing from him conversationally. The army had given him that, the ability to exist alongside others in pure functional parallel, each doing what needed doing, no performance required. The day after the conference room incident, Alan arrived to find a message from Garrett, the facility's supervisor, telling him to come to the office before his shift. He had been expecting something like this, a reprimand for entering a meeting uninvited. Perhaps. He had weighed the decision the night before while Jai slept and decided he would take the reprimand without argument. He had taken harder things without argument. He rode the subway in his gray uniform and felt the particular steadiness that comes from having nothing to prove and knowing it. Garrett's office was a windowless room near the loading dock that smelled of burnt coffee and paper. He was a thick man in his 50s, with the manner of someone who had once wanted to be somewhere else and had quietly made his peace with where he was. He was not unkind. He looked at Alan across his desk with the expression of a man who has received unusual news and is still trying to categorize it. "Sit down, Alan." Alan sat. "I got a call from Webb this morning," Garrett said, "and from Ms. Hale." Alan said nothing. He waited. This was something he had learned over years, and it still unsettled people, the willingness to simply wait without filling silence. Most people couldn't stand silence. They rushed to fill it, and in the rushing they revealed things. Alan had learned this in rooms far smaller and far more dangerous than Garrett's office. "The meeting went well," Garrett said. "Very well, apparently." Two of the investors asked specifically who the interpreter was. He looked at Alan the way a man looks at something he can't quite resolve. "You really speak Japanese and German?" "Yes," Alan said. "Where'd you learn?" Alan considered the question, not because the answer was secret, but because the full answer was long. "I picked them up over time," he said. "I had to use them regularly for a few years." "In what context?" "I was in the army." Garrett absorbed this. Nodded slowly. Then, "Ms. Hale wants to see you, whenever you finish your shift." He said it in the tone of a man delivering news he doesn't fully understand. "I don't know what she wants, Alan. I just know she asked for you specifically." He finished his shift. He cleaned what needed cleaning. He did not rush, and he did not slow down. He did the baseboards on the west corridor that most of the other cleaners skipped. He refilled the soap dispensers even though they still had some left, because running out of soap created irritation, and he preferred to prevent what was preventable. He was, in all measurable ways, the same man he always was. The fact that a 7-figure meeting had gone differently because of him did not change the baseboard's need for cleaning. This was simply what the morning required. So, he did it. At 12:30, he knocked on the door of Victoria Hale's office and went in. The office was large and spare, and the view from the window took a moment to absorb. The city spread in every direction. The East River glinting, the geometry of bridges and boroughs visible to the horizon. Victoria Hale was standing at the window when he entered, and she turned when she heard him come in. She was smaller than he'd realized up close, but the quality of her attention, the way she looked at a thing and assessed it completely, quickly without noise, that was exactly as he'd observed from the corridors. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. "Sit down, Mr. Reeves." He sat. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at him with the expression she probably used on financial reports. Interested, precise, looking for the line that told the real story. "Yesterday you saved a 7-figure meeting," she said. "I'd like to understand who you are." "I'm the day shift cleaner on 34, Alan said. She almost smiled. Almost. "I know what you do here. I'm asking who you are." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the city moved its enormous, indifferent body through another afternoon. Somewhere across the boroughs, Jai was in school, probably drawing the tired bear. Alan thought about how to answer honestly without opening every door in the house. Some doors he had closed for good reason, but a direct question from a direct person deserved a direct answer. And so he said, in a voice that had not changed in 34 years of living, "I'm a man trying to do right by his son." Victoria Hale sat with that for a long moment. He understood, with the clear-eyed patience of a man who had waited in worse places for longer, that this moment was something he had not planned for. He had not planned for the conference room, not for the languages, not for this series of conversations. He had planned for toast and morning light and a boy growing up with a father who kept his word. Everything else was just what the day brought. Then she said, "Tell me about the army." And the slight lean forward as she said it, barely perceptible, the kind of shift only the attentive notice, told Alan that she had already started asking around. That she already knew something, and that what she knew had unsettled in some quiet way the tidy categories she had arranged him in the very first moment she saw a man in a gray uniform, holding himself, shoulders level, eyes steady, like someone trusted with things that could not be undone and who had proven worthy of that trust. The second incident happened 2 weeks later, and it came not from the top of the building but from its middle, from the kind of men who are important enough to be on the 34th floor, but not important enough to be in the corner offices, men who had reached a certain altitude in the hierarchy and mistaken it for a rival. There were 4 of them at the coffee station when Alan came to clean the adjacent break room, and they were talking about the interpreter thing. He heard it before he turned the corner, the way sound carries in marble corridors when people are careless about volume. He heard his name, he heard laughter. He heard one of them say in the bright performative tone of someone who has told a story before and enjoyed the reaction, "Swear to God, Webb said he actually spoke Japanese, like fluently, like the investors were genuinely impressed." And then another voice, younger, sharper. "The janitor speaks Japanese and German." "Sure. What's next? The loading dock guy is a former NASA physicist?" More laughter. Alan walked around the corner. The laughter didn't stop immediately. It took about 2 seconds for them to register him, and in those 2 seconds he heard the full end of it unobstructed. Then it went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when the subject of a conversation becomes its audience. 4 men in their 30s, good suits, decent haircuts, the kind of faces that grew up comfortable and had never really had to reckon with that comfort. They looked at him with the expression people wear when they've been caught doing something not quite wrong enough to apologize for. Alan looked back at them. He did not speak. He pushed his cart to the sink and began emptying the trash and wiping the counter with the same pace and care he brought to every surface in the building. He could feel them recalibrating. Should we say something? Should we leave? Did he hear us? And he let them sit in that uncertainty because it was honest. They had laughed at him. They should know he had heard. But he was not going to perform anger for their benefit. What he had was something older and quieter than anger. The complete indifference to other people's opinions that comes from having been in places where the consequence of a wrong decision was not embarrassment but death. Standing in a break room being laughed at by men in good suits was, in the hierarchy of difficulties he had survived, not even on the list. What bothered him, if he was honest with himself in the 20 minutes of golden kitchen light the next morning, was not the laughter itself but what it revealed about the world Jai was going to have to navigate. The world of men who made fast assumptions. The world of categories that were supposed to stay fixed. Alan had spent 7 years serving a country those men had never in any meaningful way been asked to defend. And he had come home and taken a cleaning job because it was steady and honest and let him be at the door at 3 when Jai got out of school. In that building full of money and power, the fact of his service was simply not visible in the gray uniform and the mop cart. So the assumption held. The assumption produced laughter, and the laughter told Jai, who had inherited his father's eyes and his father's stillness and his father's tendency to know more than he said, what to expect from a world that reads men by their uniforms. He did not tell Jai about the laughter. He sat across from his son at the kitchen table that morning, the gold light just beginning its climb up the wall, and he watched Jai eat toast and explain in meticulous detail the ongoing narrative of the tired bear's business day. The bear had a meeting today about whether bears needed to wear ties. The bear's position was that ties were uncomfortable and impractical for a creature with a neck that wide. And Alan listened with exactly the seriousness it deserved and agreed that the bear had a point. Jai looked at him when they were done eating and said, with the complete unprompted accuracy of a 7-year-old who absorbs more than he is given credit for, "Dad, did something bad happen at work?" Alan looked at his son. 7 years old, dinosaur pajamas, toast crumbs at the corner of his mouth, eyes that read you page by page. "No, bud," he said. "Everything's fine." Jai considered this. "You look like the bear," he said, "when he has to go to the meeting." Alan laughed, and a real one. Short and genuine, the kind that comes up before you can decide whether to let it. I'm okay, he said. I promise. Jai nodded slowly, the way he nodded when accepting an answer, but not fully closing the question. Then he said, I drew you something, and slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a drawing of two figures, one tall, one small, both round in the way Jai's figures always were, both looking in the same direction at something off the right edge of the page. The tall figure had a small square in his hand that might have been a mop or a briefcase or a flag, ambiguous in the way children's drawings often are because the artist knows exactly what it means and assumes the viewer does too. Underneath, in the unsteady letters of a first grader still making peace with the alphabet, my dad is the strongest. Alan looked at the drawing for a long time. He folded it very carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, against his chest. Thank you, Jai. You're welcome, Jai said and went back to his toast. The meeting with Victoria Hale had not been a single conversation. After the first one, in which Alan had answered her question about the languages with enough detail to cause her to set down her pen, she had asked him to come back. He had gone back 3 times in 2 weeks, always at the end of his shift. She was intelligent enough not to push the doors he didn't open voluntarily. He respected that. What he had not told her was the full shape of it. The full shape lived in a box in the back of his closet on 168th Street. Not a box of trophies, not a monument to pride, but evidence that the man in the gray uniform had once been something the men in good suits in this building would have no adequate frame of reference for. He kept it closed because the weight of what it represented was not something you carried in the open, without a specific reason. But there were signs, if you knew what to look at. The way he carried himself in the corridors, not with the head-down shuffle of someone who has absorbed invisibility into his posture, but with the particular upright ease of a man who moves through space as if he has assessed every exit and committed them to memory. The way his hands were always still, not the stillness of passivity, but of a man who has trained his body not to betray his thinking. The way in the break room with the 4 laughing men, he had not flinched or reddened or looked at the floor. These were not the marks of a janitor. They were the marks of something else. Something the gray uniform covered the way a tarp covers a vehicle. Functional concealment of a specific and serious thing. The third meeting with Victoria Hale was different. He could sense it when he came in. Her attention was more directed, the way it is when someone has done research and arrived with conclusions rather than questions. She was standing when he entered. She had a printout in her hand, a few pages stapled together, held in the careful way of someone aware of the weight of what they're holding. I did some research, she said. I want to be straightforward with you about that. All right, Alan said. My head of security used to work in federal contracting. He told me there are service records that can be partially accessed and some that can't. He said yours falls into the second category. Most of it's still classified. He also told me that the unit designation attached to your name doesn't respond well to casual inquiry. That asking questions about it made the people he called suddenly very professional and very brief. Alan said nothing. I'm not asking you to tell me what's classified, Victoria said. I just want you to know that I know I don't have the full picture. And I need to say that I owe you an apology. You don't, Alan said. I do. She said it without the softening edge that people add when they want credit for making apologies. When you said you spoke those languages, I didn't laugh, but I doubted. The doubt was wrong. It was based on your uniform and nothing else. That's not good judgment. That's assumption. And I've made a lot of money learning to tell the difference. She held his eyes. I'm sorry. Alan sat with this. An apology from a 27-year-old millionaire delivered with the directness of a contract negotiation. This he had not expected. He found, to his mild surprise, that it meant something. Not because he needed it, but because it was honest. And honesty in his experience was rarer than people like to think, especially from people who had nothing to gain from it. I appreciate it, he said. It wasn't the first time, it won't be the last, either. I don't need people to know what I've done. I just need the work to be right. She nodded slowly. Then she said, I want to offer you a different position. Alan looked at her across the desk. This woman who had grown a company at an age when most people were still figuring out what they wanted to grow. And he thought about Jai at home with his drawings and his toast. The tired bear, the 17 pictures on the refrigerator, the folded paper in his shirt pocket that said, "My dad is the strongest." He thought about the box in the closet. He thought about the things inside it. He thought about 3 years of marble floors and golden morning light. And then he said, very quietly, "Before you do that, there's something you should know about me. Something that will change what you're about to offer." She set her own pen down. The offer was not what he expected. He had assumed, if he was honest with himself during the walk back to the service elevator after that third meeting, that Victoria Hale would offer him something like a junior interpreter role. Contract basis, supplemental income, the kind of position that let her use what he had without requiring her to fully reckon with who he was. He had prepared himself to decline it politely. He had his reasons. He had Jai's schedule, the school run, the predictability of the cleaning shift that put him home before dark. He had built a life with very specific architecture, and the architecture worked. Changing it required a reason that outweighed the risk, and a contract interpreter role did not clear that bar. But that was not what she offered. What Victoria Hale offered him, sitting across from him in that spare office with the city spread behind her like a declaration, was a position as a strategic liaison. Not translation work alone, not a title designed to make him feel useful without making real room for him. A real position, with a real salary and real responsibility. Managing the firm's relationships with its 3 largest international partners, 2 of whom were the same investors from the Tokyo and Frankfurt meetings, who had asked about the interpreter after the meeting ended, and had specifically, Victoria told him with the precision of someone citing a relevant data point, asked whether he was available on an ongoing basis. The Frankfurt group had gone further. They had told her through their representative that the quality of Alan's interpretation, not just the linguistic accuracy, but what they called the texture of it, the way he understood not only what was being said but what was meant, was unlike anything they had encountered from a professional interpreter in 12 years of doing business in the United States. Alan had listened to all of this without expression. He had learned long ago that expressions were information, and you gave information when you chose to, not when your face decided for you. Then he said, "I need to think about it." Victoria Hale had blinked once, very slightly, the way people blink when they expected a different answer and are recalibrating. Then she said, "Of course, take whatever time you need." And she said it without the condescension that people sometimes added to that sentence, the slight emphasis on whatever that implied you would need very little of it. She said it like she meant it. He noted that. He thought about it for 4 days. He thought about it during the morning shifts, during the subway rides, during the 20 minutes of golden light at the kitchen table. He thought about it while Jai explained the Bear's quarterly earnings report, an elaborate document showing the Bear's briefcase business had grown 17% this quarter, which Jai had decided was the percentage because it was his favorite number. Alan asked why 17 was his favorite. Jai looked at him with the reading eyes and said very seriously, "Because it sounds like it's trying." Alan sat with that for a long time after Jai went to bed. He thought about the box in the closet. He thought about what was in it and what it meant, and whether it was finally time to let some of it breathe again. Not as performance, not as the veteran who needed you to know what he had done, but simply as a man making a practical decision about what his skills were worth and whether it was reasonable to use them openly. He had kept them underground for 3 years because the adjustment had required stillness, because Jai had needed a father who was present and not haunted, and being present had required him to set down the weight of the other life for a while. But Jai was 7 now and steady, and Alan was steady. And maybe there was a version of this that didn't require him to keep pretending the gray uniform was all he was. He thought, too, about the men at the coffee station, not with anger, but with the clear, dispassionate attention of a man assessing terrain. Those men were not extraordinary, they were ordinary. They made ordinary assumptions, and ordinary assumptions had a way of producing ordinary outcomes, and Alan had spent enough of his life in conditions where ordinary outcomes were not survivable. He had learned to act from what he knew, rather than what he appeared to be. That lesson had cost him things he still did not have complete language for. But it had made him who he was, and who he was, he had decided, was worth more than a cleaning cart. On the fourth night he called his father in Raleigh. His father was 71, and still got up at 5 every morning out of pure habit, the residue of a working life that had never let him sleep past dawn even now that there was nothing specific to wake for. He answered on the second ring. They talked for 40 minutes. Alan told him about the offer. His father listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, with the focused quiet of a man who believed that if someone was talking to you, it was because they needed to be heard, not advised. When Alan finished, his father said, "You earned it, son. There's no shame in letting people see what you earned." That was all. That was enough. The hardest part of those 4 days was not the decision itself. The decision, once his father had spoken, was already made. The hardest part was telling Jai. Not because he expected Jai to object, but because the shift would touch their mornings. The new position would require him to arrive earlier and sometimes stay later. There would be days when he couldn't walk Jai to school. These were small logistical facts, and they were also, in the emotional accounting of a father who had built everything around his son's daily experience of stability, significant. He told Jai on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table in the gold light. He explained it the way he explained everything, directly, completely, without softening. He said the work was going to change. He said some mornings would be different. He said Mrs. Delgado would help on those days. He said that what would not change, what would never change, was that Jai was the reason for all of it. Every decision, every day, every single choice. Jai had listened with the focused quiet he had inherited entirely from his father. Then he looked at Alan and said, "Is it a better job?" "Yes," Alan said. "Does it pay more?" "Yes." Jai nodded slowly. "Then the bear says you should take it." Alan looked at his son for a long moment. 7 years old. Toast crumbs. The weight of the world on small shoulders, not bowing him a single degree. "Okay. Then I'll take it," Alan said. On his second to last day as a cleaner, one of the 4 men from the coffee station, the youngest, the one who had made the NASA physicist joke, stopped in the corridor when he saw Alan. His name was Donovan. Alan knew this because he had cleaned the nameplate on his office door 200 times. Donovan stood there for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether to keep walking or do the harder thing. He did the harder thing. "I heard you're moving to the liaison role," he said. "Strategic partnerships." "That's right." A beat of silence, then, "I'm sorry about what I said in the break room. The physicist thing. It wasn't right." Alan looked at him. Donovan was young enough that this had probably cost him something, the admitting, the standing here doing it. Alan respected that. "Appreciate that," he said. And then, because the young man had earned a little more, "Nobody's right all the time. The question is what you do when you find out you were wrong." He picked up his cart and moved down the corridor. Behind him, Donovan stood very still for a moment. Alan did not look back. But he knew, the way you know things when you have spent years reading environments with your whole body, that something had shifted in that young man. Some small rearrangement of assumption, some slight recalibration of the categories he used to sort the world. It was not redemption. It was not transformation. It was just a man getting slightly more accurate about what he was looking at. That was enough. That was, in Alan's experience, how most of the important changes in the world actually happened, not in dramatic reversals, but in small corrections, one at a time in corridors, between people who had enough decency to stop and say the harder thing. He told Victoria Hale yes the next morning, standing in her office in his gray uniform for the last time. She said, "Good," and offered her hand. He shook it. The transition took 2 weeks. He finished his shifts. He trained his replacement. Garrett shook his hand on the last day and said, "They don't make many like you, Reeves." Alan thanked him and meant it. On the first day of the new position, He wore a suit from a thrift store on 181st Street, dark charcoal, white shirt, no tie. Jai had supervised the ironing. "Press the collar first," Jai said. "That's the part people see." Alan pressed the collar first. He arrived at 8:15 and took the main elevator. He walked the corridor he had mopped 1,000 times and looked straight ahead. He knocked on Victoria Hale's door and stepped inside. She looked up. "Welcome." He sat down and opened the briefing folder. He read it with the same attention he had once given to mission parameters in conditions where misreading cost lives. On the margin of the third page, in pencil, in handwriting smaller and more careful than her usual directness, she had written 3 words. "I was wrong." He read those words. He did not comment. He turned to page 4. They began to work, and the city moved outside the windows, and Alan Reeves sat in a chair on the 34th floor of a building he had cleaned 1,000 mornings, and felt, quietly and without performance, exactly like himself. It was Marcus Webb who asked first. 3 weeks into Alan's new role, at the end of a long Thursday that had involved 2 calls to Frankfurt and a conference with the Tokyo partners that had run 90 minutes over schedule, Webb caught him in the corridor outside the liaison office, the small office that had been cleared out and assigned to Alan, the one with a window that faced north. Alan preferred north because Jai's school was in that direction, and sometimes between calls he liked to look out and know which way that was. Webb had the expression of a man who had been holding a question for some time and had finally decided to ask it. "Can I ask you something personal?" Webb said. "You can ask," Alan said. "The languages, Japanese and German. I know you said Army, but—" He paused, searching. "That's not standard, not even close to standard. And the way the Frankfurt group talks about you, the way you handle the Tokyo calls, it's not interpreter level. It's something else. Like you're not just translating, you're navigating." Alan considered Webb for a moment. The man had earned the question. He was asking not out of gossip or condescension, but out of attention. And attention, in Alan's long experience, was one of the few things that genuinely deserved a real answer. "Yes," Alan said. "That's a good word for it. Where did you learn to navigate like that? Come back after 5. I'll tell you." Webb came back after 5. Victoria Hale was still in her office. Alan knocked on her door and asked if she wanted to hear it too. She put down what she was reading immediately and said yes, in the tone of someone who has been patient for a long time and is quietly glad the patience is ending. They sat, Webb in one chair, Victoria in another, and Alan told them. He had enlisted at 19. He had been a good soldier. Not the loudest, not the most decorated in the visible sense, but the kind that certain officers noticed. Someone who absorbed information rapidly, who stayed calm under pressure in a way that seemed less like suppression and more like depth, who demonstrated in training a quality of spatial and situational awareness that his commanding officer had described in an evaluation as, quote, exceptional and operationally significant. At the end of his second year, he had been approached about a different track, the 75th Ranger Regiment. He paused here. He watched their faces. Victoria's expression did not change, but her quality of attention sharpened, the way it sharpened when she encountered a number that changed the shape of an analysis. Webb had gone very still in his chair. The 75th was not a name that required explanation, not for anyone who had paid any attention to the world in the last 2 decades. It was one of the most elite light infantry units in the history of the United States Army. It was the kind of name that, when you heard it in a context like this, required a moment of recalibration. The recalibration of understanding that the man sitting across from you was not who you thought he was, had never been who you thought he was, and that the categories you had been using were not simply insufficient, but actively completely wrong. Alan continued. The selection process was what it was. He described it without dramatization, accurately without performance, the way he described everything. The physical standards, the psychological evaluation, the kind of judgment being tested, not just of the body, but of decision-making under prolonged stress. Judgment that the Army needed from men. It was going to put in places where no one would be watching and the cost of poor decisions would not be recoverable. He had passed. He had served for 5 years in the regiment, deploying multiple times. The languages came from the assignments, he said. You're in country for extended periods. You work with local assets, with allied units, sometimes with civilian populations. You can operate through interpreters, and you do. But the best intelligence, the most accurate picture of what's actually happening, comes from being able to hear what people say when they don't think anyone important is listening. So you learn. You learn the way you learn everything in that environment. Fast, because slow has consequences. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the part he had not told anyone, the part that lived in the box in the closet. He said it not because he wanted to impress them. He said it because they had asked honestly, and because the full answer required it, and because he had spent 3 years mopping floors with a truth folded quietly inside him that deserved to be said out loud at least once, to at least 2 people, in a room with a window. In his 4th year with the regiment, his team had been operating in a mountainous region when they encountered a situation not covered by the briefing, not covered by protocol, not covered by anything except judgment. His team leader had been injured in the first minutes of contact. Alan had assumed command of a 6-man element with communications degraded, with extraction not immediately available, and with a situation that was, he used the word plainly, serious. He had held that position for 11 hours. He said this without adjectives. 11 hours. He did not describe what that meant in the specific context, what the terrain was, what the opposition was, what decisions were made in those 11 hours that he still thought about sometimes in the specific way, that the important decisions never fully leave you. He simply said it because the fact was enough, because people paying attention would understand what the fact contained. Webb was not breathing audibly. Victoria Hale had set down the pen she had picked up at some point during the telling. The room had taken on the quality of rooms where something true and heavy has just been set on the table, the particular stillness that settles when people understand they are in the presence of something that cannot be undone and does not need to be. All 6 came out, Alan said. 4 of us with injuries of varying severity. None of them died. He paused. That is the only number from my career that I still think about every single day. Every day, without exception. All 6 came home. The silence lasted a long time. The city made its evening sounds outside the window, a siren somewhere below. The low subway rumble, a distant horn from the river. Webb said in a voice that had lost its professional finish entirely, "You've been mopping floors." Alan looked at him steadily. "I've been raising my son," he said. "The floors were how I paid for it. There's no lesser version of that." Webb nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. Then he looked back up and said nothing else because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying more honestly. Victoria said after a while, "Is there anything in the box?" She hadn't known about any box. She was asking a larger question, about whether what he had described was the whole of it, or only the part he had decided to share. He said, "There's a citation, a letter from the Secretary of the Army, and a medal I've never put on a wall." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why not?" "Because walls are for other people to see," he said. "I don't need to see it. I was there." Victoria Hale looked at him the way she had looked at the margin note in the briefing folder 3 weeks earlier, with the expression of someone encountering an answer that closes a question they didn't know they had been carrying. She looked at him and then she looked away, toward the window and the north-facing city. When she looked back, something had changed very slightly in the precise, measuring quality of her face. Some small door that she kept closed, that she had kept closed for most of her adult life in the particular way that young women who inherit power learn to keep things closed, had opened just a fraction. Alan noticed this. He did not remark on it. He stood and said goodnight and went to pick up Jai. He stood after and said goodnight and went to get Jai. That night, after Jai was asleep, he stood at the closet. He did not take out the box. He stood in front of it with his hand on the door and thought about the faces in that office. Webb's stunned silence, and the thing that had shifted very slightly in Victoria Hale's expression at the end. He thought about saying those things out loud for the first time in 3 years and discovering that the words had not lost their weight in storage. They were the same weight they had always been. That was the thing about the truth. It didn't lighten with time, but it didn't crush you if you had built yourself strongly enough around it. He closed the closet. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and listened to the city and felt the particular quiet of a man who has done something honest and finds the doing has not broken him. The next morning there was an email from Victoria Hale sent at 11:43 p.m. Subject, thank you. Body, for telling us, and for everything the telling required. He read it during the school run. On the train to work he decided what to say. He sat at his desk, opened the email and typed 3 words. You were listening. He sent it and opened the Frankfurt briefing. Marcus Webb stopped by his office on the Friday of that week. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, My father was Army, 68th Infantry, Vietnam. He paused. He never talked about it either. He gave a single nod, one man recognizing in another a shared fluency in a language that has never had adequate words. Alan watched him go and thought about the quiet line of men who carried things without explanation. Webb's father, his own. He thought about Jai, who would know what his father had carried, not as a burden, but as a foundation. Then he turned slowly back to his work. The moment that changed everything came 6 months later. And it came the way the most important moments usually come. Not announced, not dramatic in its opening, but quiet and ordinary on the surface, the way a river looks calm right before the place where it turns. It was a Tuesday in February. Jai was at school. Alan was in his office on the 34th floor, working through a briefing on a new proposal from the Tokyo partners that would significantly expand the firm's footprint in the Asia-Pacific region. It was a good proposal. Alan had spent the previous 2 weeks going through it line by line, the same focused thoroughness he brought to everything, and he had found 2 structural vulnerabilities that the Tokyo team had not flagged. Not out of deception, but out of familiarity, the way you stop seeing the furniture in your own house. He had written them up carefully, in both English and Japanese, so the partners would read the concerns in their own language and understand that they were being taken seriously, not dismissed. This was the kind of thing he had learned to do, not from any course, not from any mentor, but from years of operating in environments where the difference between what was said and what was meant was the most important distance in the room. Victoria Hale knocked on his open door at 2 p.m. and said, I need you in the conference room at 4. There's something I want you to be part of. He said he'd be there. At 4 o'clock he walked into the East Conference Room, the same room where the interpreter had called in sick 8 months earlier, the same room where he had tightened the cable and adjusted the thermostat and straightened the chairs and been laughed at in the corridor outside. He had been in this room dozens of times since starting the liaison role. He had sat at this table in meetings where he was the one people were listening to. He had learned to carry that without awkwardness, the way you learn to carry most things, by simply continuing to do the work and letting the work speak without translation. Seated at the table were 5 people he did not recognize. They were introduced to him as a delegation from a consortium of international development foundations. 2 Americans, 1 British, 1 from Munich, 1 from Osaka, who were considering a major philanthropic investment in workforce development programs in New York City, specifically programs targeting veterans and career-transitioned adults. They had come to Hale Capital because Victoria had been quietly building a reputation, over the past several months, for running a different kind of firm, one that measured talent differently, that made unusual bets on unusual people. Victoria introduced Alan last. She introduced him by name and title and then said, without looking at her notes, without editorial, in the plain declarative voice she used for facts, Mr. Reeves is a former Army Ranger with 5 years of active service and multiple combat deployments. He joined this firm 8 months ago as the day shift cleaner. He is currently our head of international strategic partnerships. The Frankfurt Group has named him the most effective liaison they have worked with in the American market in 15 years. He speaks 4 languages. He raises his son alone. I consider him the best professional decision I have made since taking over this company. She said this without sentimentality, without the inflection of a story being told for effect. She said it the way she said everything, accurately, directly, as if the facts were simply facts, and facts did not require decoration to be significant. Alan looked at her for a brief moment. Then he looked at the delegation and said in English first, and then in German for the man from Munich, and then in Japanese for the woman from Osaka. Something that made all 5 of them lean forward slightly at the table. Not because the words were dramatic, but because the way they were said made it immediately clear that they were in the presence of someone who understood, at a level below language, what the work of building something meant. The meeting ran 2.5 hours. At the end of it, the Osaka delegate, a small, precise woman in her 60s who had said very little during the meeting but whose quality of attention had never wavered, stood up and spoke in Japanese for about 30 seconds. She spoke directly to Alan. The others in the room waited, because the cadence of what she was saying was clearly not logistical. Alan listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he translated for the room. Not word for word, but in the way he always translated. For meaning, not just language. He said, "She is saying that in her experience, the men who speak most loudly about their qualifications are rarely the most qualified, and that the most trustworthy indicator of a person's character is not what they do when people are watching, but what they do when they believe no one is." He paused. Then he added, "She says she knows what I was doing when I believed no one was watching. And she says it is the kind of thing that cannot be taught." The room was quiet. Victoria Hale was looking at the table. The Munich delegate had folded his hands and was nodding very slightly, the way people nod when something has confirmed a thing they suspected. The consortium signed a letter of intent that evening. Alan went to pick up Jai from school. It was a cold Tuesday in February and the street was loud with the late afternoon noise of the heights. Children, horns, someone's music drifting from a window 3 floors up. He stood at the edge of the sidewalk in his charcoal suit and watched the school doors calmly, without urgency, with the readiness of a man comfortable with waiting because he has learned the thing worth waiting for always comes. Jai came out of the building in his blue jacket with the broken zipper, carrying his backpack at the peculiar lopsided angle 7-year-olds use when thinking about something else, and walked straight to Alan with complete certainty, as if the possibility of his father not being there had never once required consideration. "How was school?" Alan said. "Good," Jai said. "We learned about rivers." "What did you learn?" "That the water looks calm before it turns," Jai said. "But it's moving fast the whole time. You just can't always see it from the outside." Alan looked at his son, 7 years old, blue jacket, the reading eyes. "That's a good thing to know," Alan said. "I know," Jai said, and took his father's hand. They walked home. They had pasta, the specific pasta with the specific sauce, the best thing. Legally binding. Jai drew at the table while Alan cleaned up. The bear today had received an award. The award was shaped like a briefcase. Jai had not decided yet what the award was for, but he said it was for doing good work without making a big deal about it. Alan said that was a very good thing to give an award for. Jai agreed and added more detail to the briefcase trophy. After Jai was asleep, Alan went to the closet. This time he took out the box. He set it on the kitchen table in the place where the gold light came in the mornings. He opened it. He looked at what was inside the way you look at things you have earned and survived and carried and kept. Not with pride exactly, and not with grief exactly, but with the specific gratitude of a man who understands that the cost of something does not diminish its value but explains it. The citation, the letter with its formal header and its careful language, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, the medal. He took it out. He held it in both hands for a moment. Then he got up and went to the refrigerator and moved 3 of Jai's drawings aside and put the medal on the top shelf of the refrigerator, next to the drawings, where the gold light would find it in the morning. Not on a wall, not in a frame. Next to the bear with his briefcase, next to the elephant with the long eyelashes, next to the drawing of 2 round figures looking in the same direction with the words, "My dad is the strongest," written underneath in the unsteady hand of a child who had already understood, without being told, everything that needed to be understood. Alan stood in his kitchen in the quiet of a Tuesday night and looked at what his life had become, earned and real and entirely his, built out of early mornings and floors and toast and steady hands, and the patient work of a man who had carried everything without breaking, and raised a son who held his hand on cold streets without a moment of doubt. He stood at the refrigerator for a long time after placing the medal. He was aware, in the particular full-body way of a man who has been trained to be aware of everything, that this was a moment he would remember. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't. Not because anyone else would see it, no one would. But because it was the closing of something that had been open for a long time, and the opening of something that had been closed. The medal was not a performance. It was not a message to anyone. It was simply acknowledgement. The quiet, private acknowledgement of a man making peace with the full shape of who he was. Setting down neither the service nor the kitchen, neither the ranger nor the father, because both were true and both were his, and neither required the other to be diminished in order to be honored. He looked at Jai's drawings on the refrigerator for a long time. He looked at the bear with his briefcase. He looked at the elephant. He looked at the two round figures looking in the same direction at something off the edge of the page, and the words underneath them, and the unsteady hand that had written them with complete confidence and complete truth. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed, he slept.